You are listening to the Enormocast.
The royal we here at the Enormocast would like to remind you that there's 3 great ways to get shit you need and get the Enormocast a little something as well. Bonfirecoffee.com, enter Enormo at checkout for great small batch fresh roasted coffee. PeterWGilroy.com, enter Enormo at checkout for amazing climbing inspired jewelry and accessories for yourself or that special belayer. In belayspecs.com, enter Enormocast at checkout to just say no to belayer neck pain. And the great thing about supporting these companies is they are the little guy. In fact, a couple of them are just one person over there at that particular little company. So you're supporting them, they are climbers, you're supporting the Enormocast, and you're getting great stuff. It's a win-win-win. Very rare in this day and age. So please consider supporting them, supporting the Enormocast, and supporting all our sponsors with your patronage.
We gotta get
Listen, where are you playing in town? Are you playing here?
We're doing the Enormo Dome, whatever it is. It's terrific.
Oh,
It's
yeah,
a
big
house. We
place
sold it
outside
out.
of town. That's a
Very
big
nice.
place. You sold it out.
20,000 seats. We really should.
Look, you better get up there before you panic. Those pens are loose. You're very good. I have really enjoyed climbing with you. We'll make it. I don't think so. But we shall continue with style. Good weather, bad weather. Now or later, anytime for climbing.
Today's show is brought to you by Black Diamond Equipment, with support from Maxim Ropes.
And the fine folks at La Sportiva.
And now back to the show.
Hello and welcome to the Enormocast. This is your host, Chris Kalous. It is 11:15 on November 2nd. Where did October go? October just disappeared. Actually, you know what? Let's erase October 2017 from the record completely. It sucked. Goodbye, October 2017. You sucked. Anyway, this is episode 139, conversation with mountain runner Joe Grant. As many of you know who listen to the show, we lost one of the great friends of the Enormocast, Hayden Kennedy, and 2 of my friends, Hayden and his partner Inga Perkins, both died last month. Inga was killed in an avalanche from which Hayden was able to unbury himself, but unable to find Inga out of despair, grief, guilt, I suppose. He returned to Bozeman and killed himself. The shock here in Carbondale, the shock at the Enormocast headquarters in my home with our families has been overwhelming. But I wanted to acknowledge it here on the podcast because Hayden was such an integral part of this show. Many of you have written me with condolences and also tributes to him, talking about how much you enjoyed having this insight into the man on the show. And I'm quite proud we did what we did here with the Enormocast and Hayden. So I bring it up because I wanted to thank you guys for those notes that you've reached out with. And hopefully I will be capable of putting together a tribute episode to him. And I didn't know Inga as well, obviously. I'd only met her in the last year through Hayden, but she was an amazing climber, an amazing adventurer in her own right. And in my mind, I had imagined that we would have talked to her eventually on the show as well. Her accomplishments certainly were worthy of an hour in the Enormocast. Just an incredible person as well. So thanks again for the notes, for the acknowledgments, for the condolences. It meant a lot to hear from you guys, actually. It continues to mean a lot. Okay, let's move on to this fantastic interview with Joe. I met Joe at a Salt Lake Climbers Alliance fundraiser up at the Black Diamond headquarters there in Salt Lake City. We were just sitting around drinking beer on a picnic table, and Joe was telling me that he really enjoyed the show, was quite excited about it. You know, podcasts fuel, I think, a lot of his long runs. And the Enormocast is on his playlist, which is super cool. And, you know, just minutes into the conversation, because I started asking him questions about the long distance running, being sort of fascinated with the mind control and everything else that has to go into it. And very quickly into the conversation, I was like, man, do you want to come on the podcast? Let's do one while we're here if we can get one done. And we sat down the very next day. And I think what we got was pretty cool. This is one that moves away from climbing a bit, but we circle back around a fair few times. And Joe's a climber. You know, he's got his gear and gets out there now and again, even though running is his main thing. But there was just so much to relate to in terms of endurance, in terms of focus and training and getting it done that relate to climbing, that I think this one's going to be really interesting for everybody. And besides, you know, even the Enormocast needs a little break from pure climbing madness once in a while. So yeah, let's check it out. A conversation with mountain runner Joe Grant. Are you the kind of person who likes things smooth and simple, like wearing tomorrow's clothes to bed or going commando no matter the occasion? Then you might like Black Diamond's new ATC Pilot, a cleanly designed belay device for single pitch projecting with smooth payout and assisted braking for when your climber is sitting on the rope, muttering about the humidity/dryness/cold/heat. Lightweight and no moving parts, the ATC Pilot is so simple it once fell in love with a snail. Check it out at blackdiamondequipment.com, or better yet, your favorite local climbing shop. And remember, Black Diamond loves the Enormocast.
Voila. So now we're at dark time. Come in here and it'll be like 1,000 degrees in here tonight. Yeah. Dyla doesn't like the air conditioning at all. So the first night she got like really messed up, like kind of sick because of all the cold air. Yeah. But then in here, we couldn't find like the central, how to turn it off centrally. Right. So we were just like turning off in different rooms, but they would kick on like halfway through the night. So you're like sweating balls and then it's like cold.
Central air conditioning just doesn't exist in Spain, except for in like people's really rich houses and stuff.
Yeah, it's a kind of like mostly a foreign concept in Europe, like period.
So it's cold drinks.
Yeah.
Some places.
Yeah, totally.
Drives me nuts.
Perrier, I guess.
Yeah.
Like, you know.
But I had
gas and sin gas, you know, when they did.
Yeah. But I was in Sayus and actually had a bulged disc. I had like a herniated disc.
Yeah.
And like it was like I was leaving in 3 days, and so I wasn't gonna like change anything just to get out of there. If it had been like 3 weeks left, I'd have left, you know, early.
Sure.
But I'm like, all right, I'll just like handle it.
Yeah.
So I go down.
So you still were going climbing?
No, I went climbing one day, and then the next day I was done. And so it's like, all right, I'll go down and get a hotel room in Gap and like just ice it and just hang out until my bus the next day. And like, so I go down there and I'm like, I go to this hotel that's got a bar in the base or in the downstairs or whatever, and I'm like, okay, perfect. And go down there and I'm like, you know, in my book I'm like, glass, you know, is it glace? Ice. For ice,
French,
and I'm just like, you know, trying to say it, and it's like,
well, and the French won't give you anything.
Well, they aren't that.
They'll just be like, fuck this American dude, you know.
And then I look like they did, like we don't have ice.
Yeah.
I'm like, and I look around, and sure, I mean, everybody's drinking normal like cocktails. There's no ice in them. They're drinking like pastis or something like that.
Right.
Yeah, I was just like, it's a fucking bar. Like, what is going on? Like, like. You have to have ice, you know, and I'm just like, okay, no ice, I got it, I'm believing, and I had to start buying frozen vegetables.
At the peas.
Store. Yeah, peas.
Yeah.
And I'd lay in the bed, and then I'd get up, and like, there'd be like this big green splotch on the freaking sheets, and I'm just like, oh, whoops.
Yeah.
Like, they're gonna wonder what the fuck was going on up in this hotel room. Like, why is there this big green
dude
splotch?
Dude getting really fucking kinky in there.
So, anyway, I finally made it home a couple days later, but boy, it was rough. The flight
was horrible.
Yeah, but you know, I was able to get my hands on some stuff in France because
over the counter shit.
Yeah, they'll hand you what you need.
What do you need? Mm-hmm. Morphine. We got it.
Yeah, and actually, I remember the pharmacist I talked to was the odd Frenchman who was like fully took, you know, felt sorry for me and like took care of me.
Well, I think that people genuinely see that you're not bullshitting.
Yeah.
And then they're like, okay, like we can actually like give you stuff, you know, whereas in the States it's like, nah, you don't have the prescription, you're not coming.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, last night when we started talking and when I began to realize that we were going to have an Enormocast, because we were just talking and and this happens to me a lot actually with people, is because this game is such a conversation that when I'm in conversations about climbing, I frequently think to myself like, oh, this would be great, or I wish I had a recorder on.
Right.
So halfway through this conversation with you, which was about the mountains but about running, it just clicked in my brain like this would be a great Enormocast, and so I'm really glad we're sitting down, because that was just last night, and we're making this happen. So we were talking about how one thing we were talking about is how your kind of mechanisms for dealing with the endurance end of what you do had changed a lot in the decade, from your 20s to now your 30s.
Yep.
So could you talk a little bit about that again, this idea of the experience changing the way you deal when you're out there on mile 75 or whatever it happens to be?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you start in the sport, I mean, I started fairly young. I was in my early 20s in terms of doing longer distances. I was primarily driven, and this is still true to this day, by the landscape. And so I wanted to get out into the mountains and just explore wild places, basically. And I really liked sort of the simplicity of running. But you have the advantage that you have when you're younger is obviously like your physical advantage, right? You're strong, you're resilient, you get injured, it takes a couple weeks to recover. And so I think there's a lot of compensation for that, growing up doing sports in school, it's the same kind of thing. All you want to do is like play whatever sports, that's there, and you just play all day, if it's 8 hours, 10 hours, whatever. And you don't really think about the recovery, injury, sort of managing all that stuff. It's so much about the activity, and you have youth on your side, right? So you can kind of like pour yourself into this stuff. And I wouldn't say it's kind of naive nearly, right? And I think a big part of the mental game at that time is just having the physical ability to overcome whatever mental weakness you actually have.
Okay.
So it's nearly like, it's not you're deceiving yourself, but you're not really growing from a mental standpoint. It's just like, well, my body can do it, and kind of like being healthy on a daily basis and thinking like you're never really going to get sick. And then when you're sick, you're like, oh, right, this is kind of how it feels, But as you get older, we were joking about this, like, getting out of bed every morning, right? It's like you hobble over to the bathroom, like sort of half arthritic, and you wait for things to kind of warm up, and it's like, oh man, my body's just like broken, And it's not, it just takes a little bit more time to warm up. I think the difference now is having that experience and being able to kind of, I've sort of been there, in those situations so many times, like out, sitting on the side of the trail, kind of losing my mind, bonking super hard from it, but you can really get into that mental space and look at it, I guess not necessarily more analytically, but like just in just having that history to be able to, I think, grow more mentally. And so you're compensating mentally for your physical shortcomings, So
like there's, there's kind of this nexus. And who knows, everybody's age maybe or experience level is different.
Right.
It's like where those two cross over and become kind of the opposite.
Yeah, and I think
your physical thing was just able to blast through your mental doubts, and now your mental thing is able to kind of like
compensate for
the physical part of it.
Totally, and I think everything is sort of like stepping stones in life, where you... the first time I did a marathon, for example, it blew my mind. Like it was absolutely like, I signed up like a month and a half before because it was in my hometown. I wasn't really a runner, and I was like, oh, I'm going to go do this thing because it's a thing to do. Like people do marathons. And I remember for like 3 months, I was like kind of injured after. I could barely walk for like the 2 weeks after the race. It was just like really, really, really hard. But now that challenge, while still difficult, just won't provide the same kind of, it won't feed you in the same way, So I think at different periods of your life, you kind of get to not necessarily wanting to do harder or bigger things, but just more interesting things that will kind of create that stimulation, So when you get done with that step in your life, it should feel like, wow, that was the biggest thing I've ever done. And it doesn't necessarily have to be from a physical standpoint, but just more how much you grew from that experience,
I don't know if actually you can put this into words, because there has to be this, this place you get to when these high endurance sports, again, mile 75, or someone just told me that you're actually going to do a 200-mile race.
Yeah, in Italy. Yeah.
So mile 120, but whatever it happens to be,
right? When
you're pushing yourself, it must kind of just be a kind of hard to describe state. But I'm going to try to make you do it anyway. What kind of games are you playing in terms of mental, physical out there on those days, or is it something that's inherent and you just have you have a way to kind of compartmentalize it or something like that?
Well, I think when you get into a really, I guess you could, it's been kind of referred to as like your flow state,
sure.
And you just get into this, and I think like similar in climbing, and when things start to really click, it's difficult to kind of pinpoint exactly what that state is. It just, everything's sort of just working, and you're not really trying that hard, but you're not really, that focused, even though you are, super focused and in the moment. It's like it sort of comes naturally, So trying to describe something like breathing, for instance, we don't think about breathing. You just kind of breathe,
Yeah.
But if you start to think about it, it's like, oh yeah, there's this process that's going on that you can't. I mean, obviously you need it to live, but it's not like. It's not something that you can really like define as, oh, well, when I'm in that state, I'm like, I'm breathing now, I think the basis is consistency. So you start with like small steps, biting off like small little pieces. And coming back to that stepping stone idea is that what seems like a massive progression to you in the moment, in the future won't seem that big, And so I think one of the big mistakes that people make when they get into things is they try to climb really hard and climb every day, and because they're just psyched on the activity, and very quickly you kind of burn out, And the older you get, the more you can just kind of like just get out there consistently, and you sort of warm up, not just the body, but also the mind,
That's an interesting point, yeah.
So you kind of come into this, I guess, osmosis, of like sort of like, oh, I'm feeling just kind of content. Like I know that things aren't going that great. I don't need to go and just like keep like banging my head against the wall. I can just like sort of let things be. And I guess like, to me, a lot of the conclusions often like in hindsight is looking at it and saying like, oh, when I just sort of let go of trying too hard, it just kind of happened,
sure.
And I think like if you're sitting on the side of the trail bonking, it's just a mental state, So if you can kind of rationalize that in the moment and just kind of get a little bit above, yourself and see yourself sitting there, you're like, okay, I'm just kind of sitting here, and you're rationalizing it in a very, very simple way. You're putting it in the most sort of clear terms, because effectively that's what it is. It's just having some sort of clarity over the situation rather than trying to say like, hyper analyze, what the feeling is, because it is a feeling, it's not something that's, it's not something that you can break down. I guess it's like where the art and the science kind of like sort of, mesh, right?
Well, it's really interesting because, I just talked to Steve Swenson and put that one out a little while ago, and that was my question for him, which is, I think, again, the obvious question about these high altitude guys, especially the ones that go back time and time again.
Yeah.
Other than, are you some sort of amazing physical specimen, but how is it that you are the guy that just puts himself back into those terrifying, and then also just physically? He said the same thing, like, oh, pain sometimes it's a warning to say, hey, you're gonna die,
right?
Or whatever. But he said mostly on those trips it's an emotion, it's a feeling, and therefore he's kind of put the same thing into his words of, he can divorce himself and look at it and say, well, this is a feeling, and so I should be able to control it, or I should. And that idea of you stepping away really made sense to me in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and it's moments in time. I don't think you're always going to have the same mechanism of getting to that place. Like the place that you're in at the time is kind of going to dictate, how much or how you're going to react to the situation. And you certainly have like tools to do that, and you feed off of past experience. You're like, okay, I've been there, whatever. But I think a lot of it's just sort of having that awareness of kind of where you are, and maybe just realizing like your insignificance in the universe is kind of like a nice humbling way to put it, you know, on a personal level. It's just like, well, I'm doing this, it's elective. I've chosen to be here, you know, for some reason, this sounded like a good idea when I was like, you know, sitting on the couch thinking about it. I was like, oh, that'd be really cool to go do this. And then you're like, you know, 2/3 of the way and you're like, shit, like why am I here, you know? And I think that maybe comes down to then intrinsic motivation, you know, as to that why question is something like I ask myself a lot. It's just like, you know, why are you out there? And not to get, I think it's sometimes it can be a little difficult if you're doing that in the moment. Like you don't want to do that too much in the moment. Sure. But having that, you know, Kurczak Wojtyka, is that how you pronounce it? Polish climber?
Good enough, yeah. We know who you're talking about. I'm sure there's some unpronounceable vowels for
I probably butchered it. Yeah. But, you know, he got a lot into that, and I think there was moments where he was maybe too philosophical on the mountain. Mm-hmm. You know, and I think he tried to discuss this, where it's just like, man, you start to get angsty and nervous because you sort of focus your energy on things that you can't really control, like exposure, or you're looking at it and you know, it's just there. Like the void is there, you're standing above it and you're thinking you can choose to respond to that however you want, really. Right. You know? And so depending on how you sort of angle that mental focus, right, it's going to kind of make or break your experience. And so that's where I feel like kind of that letting go piece of like, well, things are as they are, you know, not to sound cliche. It's really difficult to actually not put in cliches.
For sure. No,
you know, because
I understand.
Things are like quite simple, really. And so when you try to analyze them, you're like, well, yeah, it's just like, it is what it is, you know? Yeah. But it is, you know? And you know what I mean?
That's the next step on it is what it is.
Yeah.
But it is. Yeah.
And I think it's that kind of side of things that it's like, I can get in my head at home and really kind of analyze things, and you know, after a big trip or a big race or whatever it is, sit there and really sort of analyze the mental piece. But during, you can't be too much in your head that way. You know, it's sort of like once you've set your mind and you've decided that this is where you want to be, your intention, your motivation has to be intrinsic. Like it has to come from some place of like, I want to be in this space. And whatever, like nearly going in without preconceived sort of notion of what's going to happen. You know, you have a general idea of what's going to unfold, but emotionally, you sort of have to let the experience kind of take you, you know? Right. And that's kind of what's interesting about it.
Well, right? I just thought of that, like that's maybe even, right, what you're seeking out there.
It is. It's you're seeking, I think personally I'm seeking growth, and I'm seeking things that are interesting. And so if I always go into it with a mindset of like, well, you know, this is what's going to happen, and I sort of block my mind in some ways to like, well, I need to eat now, I need to drink now, I need to like do this and that. And you know, those are important things, but they can kind of distract from sort of the wholeness of the experience. And then every kind of experience is going to be quite similar. It's going to stay on a fairly physical level, and you're not going to be able to kind of open different spaces in your mind to like explore, you know, new things.
That's interesting because it seems like almost like a contradiction in terms of being a competitor. Yeah.
It's not compatible.
It feels like you should be trying to control. I mean, the instinct would seem like, okay, I'm going into this race and I need to control all these variables because I need to run this kind of race to win. Right. But it sounds like for you anyway, and probably for most people out there on these kind of runs, you have to do that to a certain extent. But if you're too rigid, it probably, you know, you're going to maybe, and this is just conjecture, but it feels like that makes you miss opportunities that might actually improve your performance because you're like, no, this is the way it has to be done. And yet there's maybe a voice saying, no, if we actually do this, this is going to go better for you.
Well, I think there's the kind of the soul aspect of things,
sure.
and then there's the performance aspect of things. And, if you're going into pure performance, it's a very nuts and bolts kind of thing, But at the very, very high end, there is an intangible thing. I actually had a really interesting conversation with Nolly about this. In the first 2 years of sort of trying his project, he was very focused on kind of like, all the little like strength aspects of every single move and how to get, everything so dialed and like, thinning out and diet and all these things. And then kind of like the more he sort of just started to kind of let go a little bit, it wasn't like the discipline went away or he wasn't still like obsessed with the problem or trying to like, climb it, fully, but it was more, it's a slight mental shift, and that's where kind of that intangible comes into play. And I think at a very high level of racing, everyone's fit. Like people show up at the Olympics, for instance, and everyone's ready to go, right? They're all, and they've had all all the best training, the coaches, the nutrition, like all these things, right? And yeah, certainly genetics might play a role in impacting this, but I do think that there's like it just kind of intangible that makes things, really click, like sort of that upper end of the glue, right? But it kind of just depends what you want to do. If you want to be like a world club climber, it's going to be very specific, right? And just what you're going to need to how you're going to need to train, how you're going to need to prepare, and the format of the event is also rigid. It's not like, oh, I'm kind of feeling this problem today and I'm just going to kind of keep, doing laps on, or do what, do whatever. It's like, that's not the point of the thing, right? You're supposed to go and it's the same in a race. I can't be halfway through the race and you're like, oh, that trail kind of looks cool. Right. And just like sort of go off on a tangent. It's like, no, like you're there to race, And so I think over the years, maybe when I started, I certainly started with more of I just wanted to go running in the mountains. That was my initial motivation for it. But then when you get more into racing becomes the priority, and you kind of lose sight a little bit of that, back to basics, kind of like why I was doing this in the first place. And it becomes year after year very much about events. And then it just gets kind of boring,
right?
Because you get to a place where you've sort of, you can go chasing times, you can do these courses over and over, and you can, and I'm not like dissing that. I think there's people who absolutely love that and find, what they're looking for in that kind of aspect of the sport. Personally, it's not really what drives me, So it is trying to find that balance later in sort of my career, so to speak, to have a similar level of enjoyment, but also, realize that, maybe what I'm looking for, I can't really find in racing anymore, and that leads me to wanting to different projects like the 14ers last summer or something like that, where it's looking at doing something that will be maybe more fulfilling than just the confines of, a race.
Well, do you think that we started this about the arc of becoming more experienced, growing older.
Yeah.
Do you think there's a maturity in that as well? Because I feel like one of the things that might help when you're let's say you're gonna do a 100-mile race.
Yeah.
With competitors, you sign up, the course is set, there's other people there. Versus going and just saying, okay, I got my thing set, I'm going to run for 100 miles.
Yeah.
Like there has to be a motivator that you're in a race, and so I need to finish this frickin' race, and I need to go a little quicker if I want to win there. And maybe with maturity, you can kind of like not need that to go out and do these sort of personal goals, or am I like off in nowhere land here?
No, I don't think you are. I think it depends, because I think, coming back to like...
in maturity in your case, I'm not saying like other people who don't do that are less mature or whatnot. But.
Well, like I said initially, I think for me, I'm very like landscape driven. The races that I pick, and this has been true, and trying to fit it in somehow into, because there's the demands of being a professional, right? And like the way this, what is happening in the sport and kind of what you want to do. So it's sort of like, if you want to be in that space, you kind of have to check certain boxes, right? You sort of have to prove yourself. And, it's like in climbing, you're like, okay, I have to climb a certain level, a certain grade, or do certain projects to have, validation, not just from the community, but even like, for sponsors and for all of that,
that's just the truth.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't say that you've arrived, because that's like a very subjective thing, but once you kind of like got there and you feel like, okay, like I've got enough presence,
street cred kind of thing.
You just kind of feel, I guess, and that is kind of like a confidence, maturity thing of just feeling like, okay, like I'm not, it's not like I'm done or anything, but it's more just like you feel comfortable as to where you are. Then you can start to sort of expand a little bit your options, and look into, because if somebody goes and does like I'm thinking something like the Wonderland Trail around Mount Rainier.
Okay.
It's a 96-mile loop around the base of Rainier, And so it's a perfect loop. There's this whole idea of circumnavigation, which is present in a lot of cultures, and, circumnavigating a mountain as opposed to going up it. I really like that kind of concept. When I got into it, when I first came to the U.S., I grew up in France, and so when I first came to the U.S., one of the things, I moved to the Pacific Northwest, so running around like Mount Hood, running around Mount St. Helens, running around, Rainier, it was like, that to me was enough of an objective. I didn't really care about the time. It was more just the aesthetics of this loop really fed, what I was looking for.
Oh, cool.
And then moving fast allows you to do it over, say, a day as opposed to 3, 4, 5, or, a week or however long. And I'm not... That aspect is not necessarily a bad thing. Like, it's nice to go out and sit and take your time and hike and camp, and it's an immersion in a different way, Whereas when you're kind of at that pinnacle of your physical ability and you're immersing yourself in that landscape, something like quite special comes out in that. At least for me personally, I like how speed impacts your mental state, essentially. It's if I'm just strolling along, I'm not having the same experience as if I'm like right on that edge,
Sure. Yeah.
And that's, I think, so looking at a landscape and saying like, oh, this is a loop or a point to point, or there's some sort of logical aesthetic to it, it speaks to me a lot more than going and chasing a performance, on some sort of contrived course, because that will yield like, a podium spot in like some sort of World Cup thing. It just doesn't really interest me, and hasn't really ever. So I've always tried to pick events that, like one of my favorite events is in Southern Colorado. It's called the Hard Rock 100. Starts in Silverton, goes to Ouray and Telluride, and then comes back to Silverton. And they change directions every year. And, you're running in the San Juans, and you head out and you're in your shorts and t-shirt, and you don't really need to, there's no required gear. You don't need to bring anything, and there's these little, aid stations along the way, and you can just kind of go run in the mountains on this really, really cool loop. And so but it's still a competitive event, and it's an event. So there's structure to it and everything, but there's something kind of quite appealing to me about that, as opposed to like being part of a circuit that's, and I did that for a while, like where, you got really into the racing aspect, but then you just kind of end up being at the start line and be like, okay, this is my job. Like, here I go. I've trained, I'm fit, I'm ready to go. I'm going to race. And then it's a good result or a bad result. It doesn't, I don't know. It just sort of disappears then, whereas something like running around the Wonderland or we're running Hard Rock in that context. I remember it,
Right.
And it stays with me, and it kind of builds onto onto your imagination of like, ooh, like if I can do that, then maybe I could take these skills to, bigger mountains or bigger objectives. And Killian, going up on Everest, a couple weeks ago, I think that, a lot was discussed about this whole sort of metrics of like trying to set this record going up the mountain. And knowing Killian, having talked to him about this, I think that it's more of opening up possibilities rather than like, oh, I set this time, and there's certain external demands like from how do you market this? How do you make it, like, how do you pay for this trip, you know? And so, well, if we set it in the context of racing and, you know, we're going to go and try and do the peak as fast as possible, people can kind of relate to that, you know? But I think for him, and I don't want to speak for him, but my sense is that, like, okay, you go up Everest twice in 5 days without oxygen or fixed ropes. It's like, wow, that opens up some really interesting possibilities of what you can do in terms of linking, you know, other mountains, you know? And so I think that's kind of this idea of utilizing, you know, this fast and light approach in gradually building on what you're doing to create new objectives, really, you know?
Well, as long as we're doing that, let's talk about your 14ers expedition or goal or whatever you wanted to call it. Explain what you did there, and then we'll get into kind of the details and the adventures that you had on the way. Yeah.
Well, so like, and this kind of ties into what we were just saying, where for me, like, having done a lot of racing and being really fortunate to travel around the world and see all these great places and do all these races, I'd come back to home in Colorado. I live outside of Boulder, in Gold Hill, a little mining town. I always would get back at the end of the summer and think, man, there's so much to see and do in Colorado. I really want to explore my backyard, you know? And the 14ers are iconic to the state, and it's something that, you know, the record has been done in a variety of ways, and people have linked the peaks in all kinds of ways. And to me, I was like, I want to do something in my backyard that connects with who I am, you know? And so the style I chose to do it was starting and finishing from my home, doing it self-powered and, you know, self-supported. And so the way the peaks are organized, I kind of organize in clusters. And so I wanted to bike to ranges, you know, because running 100 miles on a dirt road, you know, say to the Crestones, is just not that interesting, and it will take you a long time. You know, whereas biking it, you kind of sit there, you know, you'll get there and it's going to take you about a day, you know, and you can also carry your gear on the bike to then, when you actually get to the peaks, you can just do it as if it was a normal day of running, you know? So I really like the idea of utilizing the bike as like this tool of transportation between the mountains. Still self-powered, it's still slow enough to kind of take it all in, but it's fast enough that you're not like, it's not gonna take me 3 months, you know, or more to do it, right? And so for me, like, this kind of bike run, I guess, hike combo, because let's be real, like, I wasn't, you know, dropping the bike and freaking cranking up the peaks, like running every day, you know?
Just like running across the Capitol Peak knife edge.
Yeah, well, actually,
you did?
But it's kind of funny because I have an image of that, or like some footage of that, where like I kind of eat shit, like on, not just, I like just like slip on the knife edge because I'm like dicking around, you know, kind of going over it, like, oh, like this is like walking a tightrope and stuff, and then I like slip on the thing, and anyway. But yeah, so like, you know, to me, it was this idea of wanting to explore my extended backyard and have a context, you know, for exploration, really, you know, and see kind of what would unfold, you know, over a trip like that. So I set off, and coming back to what I was saying earlier, is I do like to kind of be on the upper end of my physical ability, because I just find that to be a little bit more interesting, you know? And so the way that the kind of the mountains play out, there's Culebra Peak in the south, which is you need a permit to climb that mountain, right?
It's surrounded by the ranch.
Yes, the ranch owns it, and it's a single day permit to climb Culebra, right? And so they weren't issuing any permits in August. And so the latest I could get was for July 30th. And so that kind of dictates, like, you have to be there to climb it on that day,
right?
You know, especially for something that's public, right? With like a spot, and, you know, people are watching. It's like, you can't really go and poach it, you know?
Right.
You know, so having that like visibility, right, from the outside is like, no, I want to do this like proper.
Up and up, yeah.
So you get the permit for that, and then I was doing this race, Hard Rock, that I mentioned earlier, 10 days before starting Culebra, or starting the 14ers. So I started on July 26th of last year and had 5 days to make it down to Culebra. And because you're self-powered, there's certain peaks that you just have to do on the way down. So there's about 8 of them. Yeah, there's 8 of them before you get down to Culebra, because on a bike, it would take a long time to come back, retrace, right? So you got Bierstadt and Evans and Pikes Peak and the Crestone group, and then finally down to Culebra. So started July 26th, booked it down there, hitting those peaks along the way, sleeping 2 to 4 hours a night. And, something like the Crestones, it's like 514ers. It is an 8-hour outing, So you've rode 100 miles the day before, gone up Pikes Peak, and you're coming to do this. And so that immediately kind of gets you okay, here we go, boom, we're starting this. And what's interesting about that is it felt very much like an event, it was not what I wanted. I wanted this to be the opposite of that, because I was kind of tired of the whole racing thing, and I just wanted it to be a little bit more free form. But I got this date that I need to be there, and here I am charging down the peak, and it just felt like a lot of pressure. So mentally I was all messed up, and it just wasn't what I expected, But that comes back to this, don't go in with preconceived notions of what's going to happen. The trip's going to be what it is, And then after Culebra, the San Juans, it was just full-on monsoon. Things got insane, weather-wise. And I was still, very much attached to, I brought a bivy sack and a sleeping bag, no tarp, no pad, no anything. So I was kind of, nervous about, man, it's freaking raining all the time, and getting just worked by, the weather and the conditions, and attached still to how we normally think about things, where it's I need a perfect little spot to camp and recover, and then be able to go up the next day. And so it creates a lot of mental angst, around watching the lightning and the weather, and just not knowing when to go up. And then about halfway through the trip, things just started to shift. I guess you just get more attuned, and you start to pick better camping spots, more naturally. It's oh, there's a little nook there that's dry under the tree. It's been dry for 2 weeks. Everything else is saturated and wet. I'm just going to slot in there and, sleep 8 hours in the pine needles and be ready to go the next day, And so there's this shift into coming a little bit more animal, really, and you sort of start to let go of the trip. That just is the framework and the context for this personal exploration, really, And that to me was the most fascinating aspect of the whole, the whole thing. It's I'm not there to really chase records. I'm there to set a context, see what unfolds, and then really learn something about myself,
And did you have, was there some record to break? In terms of the
self-powered
the
bike
the
and
whole thing. Yeah.
So a guy, Justin Simoni, did it a couple years prior, and so he did it in 34 and a half days. And what was nice about that, which he's the first one who did it in that style.
Right.
So there's the ultimate driving to the trailhead and going up and down the peaks as fast as possible, and that's in 9 days. A lot of sleep deprivation. You're just sitting there in the back of the car while your crew's driving you and to the next peak, feeding you, and it's very, very hard. But it's just not really what I was interested in. Right. So Justin kind of set this style where I was that just kind of speaks to me. It makes sense, And the nice thing about having 34 days there as a framework is okay, I know roughly how long it's going to take, give or take, it will be somewhere in around a month, So I could tell my wife when I'm leaving, I was I'll be back in a month, kind of thing. And so that helps, certainly. It's a little bit different when you're the person, you're next. You're not the person who's establishing that initial sort of initial thing. So that's where I felt focusing on the record is kind of nearly missing the point for me. It was well, but what else is there? And people have asked me would you do it again and try and go faster and all that? And it's just that was the experience, And so it helped to have references and to see okay, that took him 2 days here and 1 day there, and but it didn't really I don't know, it wasn't really on my mind, other than just that natural desire to want to kind of push myself at the upper end, So yeah, it was I don't know.
So when you were out there, it's the height of 14er season.
Yeah.
There's lots of people.
Yeah.
You're running by them. I don't know if you're doing them in the middle of the day, at night. Probably some of them got...
Everything kind of jumbles,
So was there some notion in sort of the 14er or maybe the running world that you were up to this? Or was it something that you just... was it under the radar while you were doing it?
Yes and no. I mean, no in the sense that I've got my Instagram, I've got like this spot tracker, so people can follow online and see that's like the new thing. It has to be done like that. You're out there. Well, it's to validate and people, and it's actually in terms of my own experience, it's super unintrusive, right? Like you put the little spot device in your pack, and it's just there, and it's just bleeping to the world.
Right.
But then on the other end, people can get on there and see this is where you're stopping for the night, or this is, So I think it's kind of cool how much interaction people get with how little it interferes with your own experience.
Sure. Yeah.
That's a good thing. I mean, there was definitely moments where you'd bump into people like, oh, you're that dude doing the 14ers. The weather was heinous the first 2 weeks.
Okay,
so there wasn't that many people out there.
You're the only idiot out there. I'd storms.
No, I'd bust up the tree line, and it's hailing, and I'm sitting there under a tree, take a nap for an hour. Right. There's a little window, and you bust up the peak, and you kind of come back down. And, so there was a lot of that. Mm-hmm. And then the weather got better in the second half, although it did snow the last week, which was wild. But I spent a shit ton of time alone.
Right.
Like a lot, and I got in my head a lot. And so what was weird was I would come into towns and, because, Colorado's super connected and you'll go into lots and lots of little towns. When I did the Elks, for instance, I go through Aspen 6 times.
Okay.
Because you come over Independence Pass, you drop into Aspen, Castle and Conundrum's kind of, an out and back to town. Then you've got, the Bells and Pyramid, do those in a cluster, and then you go to Capitol and Snowmass. And so you do those in 3 days, coming through Aspen each time, 6 times, right? So I'd kind of just go into... there's this little burger joint right next to the hockey rink there, right in the middle of town. And I'd go in there and set up everything to charge, my batteries and all that, eat a ton of food. But you're like a ghost, you're in your own world completely. People can't really, it's very hard in a nutshell to be what's going on, in your life right now, it's just so, because, people ask, it's what do you do today? I was I went up, Castle and Conundrum, or something. And they're oh, cool, that's an awesome hike and everything. And you're not just going to launch into...
Well, no, I actually ran it, sir. And
or
here's what I'm doing.
This is the 38th mountain or whatever. It's just no, you just can't, right? And so you just spend a lot of time kind of in that strange little zone of being in contact with people, but also being very alone in regards to kind of what you're actually doing. And I thought that it would be a little bit more conducive to people meeting me and everything, but the weather just ended up being so bad that people were fuck that, I'm not coming out,
Right.
and so a lot of it was just spent me just kind of being out there dealing with things, which I think made it kind of special in some ways. It's not really what I expected, but it also was a good way to just to have those really kind of introspective moments, out there, and feel I don't know, you feel just a little more clear on the sense of what life is all about, and you would come back into town and I don't know, just a little bit more at ease of hey, the world just kind of keeps spinning. I'm doing this thing, they're doing their thing, and you talk to people and it just feels I don't know, nearly less intense in some ways, you're doing something that's really intense, but then it kind of put things in perspective for me a little bit. It made it hard coming back afterwards though. Coming back after a month, on out there was pretty intense, It just a lot of media attention, a lot, you kind of click back into all this the social world, and demands and just regular life, right? Whereas you have this luxury when you're out there of all I need to do today is just kind of go up the mountain,
Right.
And it's just so nice and it's quite addictive really, and there's this, and I think it just taps into that primal state of just being like, oh, this is kind of what we're meant to do. Somehow it's just like, travel on foot and, scramble up peaks, and like you eat, you drink, and you sleep. And it's a very like kind of organic process. Mm-hmm. And then when you get back into all the confines of, the structure of what we've created, in our lives, it can get, I don't know. I felt like quite depressed for like 3 months after.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And I think that's probably true for, most big trips, when you come back and you've just been out there for a really long time, like in mountaineering or things like that, people come back like, whoa, like after, you have a very intense experience and bringing it back to the real world, so to speak.
Right.
Not that isn't the real world. It's just that it's not the structure that we're used to, you know? And so it's kind of just hard. Like you tap into something it feels so right. And then a lot of things get irritating. And then like when you
that
come...
must make you really pleasant to be around.
Yeah, no, it was freaking hard, man. Right. Like just coming back to that. But then I think it was like right around the New Year. So it was like 3 months after, 3-4 months after the 14ers, I was like, and it comes back to that mental piece from the beginning. It's like things are what they are, and I can't really control. Like if somebody's like writing me to ask me about like, what did you eat? Like, like a journalist will say like, what was your diet on this thing? I was just like at the convenience store, like a freaking raccoon. Like I was eating everything, man. Like I'd eat like, a bag of Oreos in the morning is 1,200 calories, hit 2 like, those little cream double espresso Starbucks thing. I don't eat that shit normally,
right.
But there I just didn't really.
Just throwing it on the fire, like
yeah,
throwing
and it's not like
in the furnace.
Exactly, and it's not like your diet, and it's just like, no, it's just like, it's freaking like just whatever. Like you're kind of rummaging through the garbage, like just ready to, but it's cool, like, because it feels like, I don't know, like less structured, just like more natural, nearly. Like even though you're eating unnatural kind of
yes,
like crappy stuff, you're also feeling like a little bit more just, I don't know.
Like a raccoon, like you're going to eat it.
Exactly.
If you throw an Oreo at a raccoon, he's going to eat it.
He's going to eat it.
Yeah.
He's going to eat it,
Yeah, gluten and everything.
Yeah, no big deal. Gluten, dairy, you hit all the allergens, Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you about the community within this sport or this part of the sport.
Yeah.
It has to be somewhat small, even worldwide.
Sure.
And especially at the levels that you're doing it, your cohort has to be pretty small. I talk a lot about the community of climbing and how important it is to us and how it's kind of the thing, really.
Right.
What's it like for you and in this particular sport? And you're also a climber, and so you have a feeling for, our community too.
Sure. Well, I think running, it's a global thing,
mm-hmm.
like, and not necessarily like ultras and long distance, but people get that, at all levels. Like Boulder is 58,000 people that come out to run a 10K in Boulder.
Mm-hmm.
That blows my mind, And so there's some relatability at a very basic level that just anywhere you are in the world, running's just like, oh, right, you're a runner. Like you have to kind of explain climbing to some,
mm-hmm.
It's just like, oh, what are you doing? Like, sort of grabbing on these little holes. So the community is sort of informed, right? Even somebody who's really new to it, you have to kind of come to this and feel like, okay, like understand like kind of the systems and how it works. Running's so basic. It's just like, well, you go out and run. So there's that initial broader community that forms that is just there, right? And then as you get into these more like niche kind of aspects, and trail running is, sort of one subset, the broader one, and then that gets into like ultra running, and then there's like, mountain running and, thing. And I don't really like labels and trying to like, but it definitely ends up being that way, where there's little groups that will kind of, have their own way of thinking and, doing their own thing. And it's hard to say like how I fit into the community, because my interest is more in I don't know. It's just it's running. I just see it as just like the tool to go and explore these places, rather than there's less. I feel like less of a culture around it, like where climbing has a very defined culture, and certainly there's the gym scene, there's
sure.
sport, there's and there's all those variations in that. And I guess running has the same thing with like track and field, and road racing and marathons is like very different to trail and ultra, and there's different feel in there. But right now I would say in the trail scene it's kind of a bit splintered, where on one aspect is very performance driven, and so there's issues like doping, and it's kind of going down that whole, like the cycling sort of, route of just everything is very much focused on that top end. And there's like federations and governing bodies, and, it's not going to the Olympics, but it's that kind of vein, right, of sort of institutionalized, structured version of it. And then there's also just like people just want to go out and run, and just have a good experience out on the trail. And I don't think, I connect obviously with the latter, but, it's not that other sort of aspect is very prominent right now. And I think it will continue to sort of diverge, over the next, I don't know, over the next, few years, where there will be more structure on one end, and then more like nearly rebellion on the other end of like, just like, fuck that. Like, I want to just go and do my own thing. And so there's one of the things that's popular on that aspect is fastest known times, right? This idea of FKTs, which is you set your own course and you try and go and run it as fast as possible. And that can be anything from, just busting up one peak, and it's like a 30-minute kind of effort, to multi-day things. Like, I guess the 14ers would fit into that idea of a fastest known time. So that's a growing segment, of the community that's getting more and more popular.
And is that kind of a result of these technology of being able to keep even
track of stuff?
Yeah, because otherwise, you have in a competition, in a set course, you have someone keeping time, and it's all on the up and up. But 15 years ago, it was self-reporting, and who knows. Yeah. But now you've got this way of with the GPS stuff of
right.
This is how fast, because look, I see his dot arrive or whatever.
Yeah, but I mean, like, think about it in climbing, how like it's always been an honor system.
Sure, yeah.
And that debate is very much present. It's just like, well, did you climb it? And there's always this like Uli on Annapurna, and that whole and it's interesting. I mean, I think that's existed forever, like that kind of controversy.
Ure. No matter what it is, yeah.
Yeah, but
it has. I mean, if you, in mountaineering, and Denali and
right,
all these different things, yeah.
People will go and claim stuff and lie about it, and maybe it's true, maybe it's not. But it kind of just gets down to this, like, I don't know, how important is it to you that this person did it, or is it more like the takeaway, really? Is it more the idea of it? It's like, if you have integrity and you're going and doing this, you're doing it for the right reasons.
Right.
And so you're going to come back and you have a story to tell, and you're going to have like, this is like a transformative experience, and that's what you're going to communicate on, But if you just focus on the performance aspect of like, well, I did this climb and like, I swear I did it kind of thing, yeah, it just gets into this weird, like, little, like, sort of debates around, like, well, I don't know. Like, it just focuses, in my opinion, on the wrong things.
Right.
So it's a tricky balance, If you're going to go and say do an FKT, and you're seeking external validation from that, and it's important to you that time get recognized, that climb get recognized, then maybe there is an argument to have some form of accountability for that. A live system is pretty good at that, because you can mess with a GPS file. It's just a text file, so it's like you go in and put whatever you want,
Right.
We could go climb Everest in like 7 hours tomorrow, just do it online.
I never thought of that.
Yeah, but you know what I'm saying? Like, it gets into that stuff where it's just like that validation is, so yeah, proof is important, but I think then it comes down to just like basic kind of, integrity, and saying like, no, if you trust certain people, and then the other people have like maybe a little bit more shaky sort of track record, and you're like, I just don't know,
Right.
And so what do you do? Do you choose to focus on sort of debating that ad nauseum just to like, I don't know, prove your point that person didn't do it or did do it or whatever? Or do you just kind of focus on the aspects that are interesting and that like, wow, this is like aspirational to me, you know, and like I could see, it's not like you don't want that person to lie, but it's just like the idea of it is, in a sense, is that's what the dream is, that's what's driving you, that's what's like, it's like, wow, somebody can go out and do that, and it's not like you want to deceive yourself, but you want to have those big kind of aspirational things to hold on to. And I mean, maybe I'm naive, but I just believe that a lot of people are honest, and a lot of people are out there doing it for the right reasons. And if they claim that they've done something, I typically have more inclination to believe them.
I think climbing is the same way in general, because I think there's a weeding process, because if you even get to the level where, it's even possible that you're up there. I mean, unless it's a complete fabrication, which in the history of mountaineering, there's been complete and utter, they never stepped on the mountain fabrications. Yeah. But if it's, you're good enough to even get close.
And maybe it's more tricky.
So it seems like by the time you get there, it took a lot of personal integrity in your life to be that disciplined.
Totally.
Do you know what I mean? So I have a tendency too to think like, okay, well, that person, if they're a shit and they've lived their life, this kind of person, they probably aren't going to be good enough to even get anywhere near it, because it takes so much. Yeah. But at the same time, when sponsorships and all these things get thrown in, it's, you're like, well, I don't know.
And it does
I generally believe people too in terms of climbing as well. Yeah.
And there's like, there's the first ascent aspect. And if you're kind of like breaking new ground and you're utilizing that as like that's what you're going to go do your talks about. That's what you're going to get sponsorship over. There is some sort of like, well, this better be true.
Sure.
Because it would suck if it's not really, because that's the whole point, is that if you're doing something that's groundbreaking, well, we hope that you did it, because otherwise it kind of defeats the purpose.
and you've robbed
that first ascent
or
whatever it is.
So.
And so that
I mean, the true Zen master would be, well, he didn't take anything from you, because your experience is going to be your experience. But we're humans, so
we'll debate about this stuff,
Right.
Yeah, for sure. So
well, and one of the things too with the technology, I guess one of the other points I was making is just that these what did you call them again? The
FKTs, fastest known time.
Yeah. The technology also just helps make them accessible to people, and they can find out the information. And you were talking about things being aspirational. I mean, that's got to be nice. If I'm just some Joe Blow, I can I know what to shoot for here. And it's just out there, eat more in a way that is more, just like everything it's disseminated information that's probably quicker and more obvious.
I mean, the spot trace. Yeah. It weighs 3 ounces, it's tiny. It has no buttons other than on and off. And you just put it in your pack, and, it just doesn't impact your experience,
right, at all. Yeah.
So to me, if there's something, and what it offers, they do this a lot in bike packing, where there's, the underground kind of bike pack race scene is just, you click the spot on and everything's on her. You do it yourself. You can't accept help and everything from other people. You bike from point A to point B as fast as you can. And you sort of broadcast it to the micro niche of people who are into that stuff, And if you are into it, you're watching the little dot and you're like, oh, well, I wonder where they're at now, Yeah. And it's kind of cool. I'm not opposed to technology, especially if it's kind of seamless that way. Sure. And it offers a lot of really positive experiences for the people who are following. I mean, I do it myself. When there's live broadcasts of stuff, I feel weird about doing it, the whole Snapchat on Everest kind of idea, it's just I don't know how I feel about that. But at the same time, it's kind of cool to click in and be like, oh, this they're doing it
there
right
he
now.
goes, yeah.
And it's this stuff's happening live, or you know, like on the Dawn Wall or everything. It was kind of weird, but at the same time, like, you're sort of psyched that you're there, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I mean, I could never be up there doing something like that, but having that opportunity to be able to have some sort of interface to see that, it's an interesting, you know, thing. And and that probably comes back into then the sponsorship aspect, the professional aspect, and sort of how much or how little you want to play the game. It can be climbing, just like running, is, you know, it can be pretty selfish, you know, if that is what you're doing and you're just doing it for yourself, but you're also in a professional realm. It's like, well, what's the point, really? Like, why, if you're not sharing any of this stuff, and yet you're getting paid to do it?
Yeah, you have to, right?
It's kind of
you're
like,
not really getting paid to do it. You're actually getting paid to share it.
You are.
Yeah.
And that's
doing it is you to be doing it anyway.
Exactly.
So,
and so that's where it comes into play. And I think like that opens it up to like the broader community and saying like, hey, yeah, I'm doing this thing. And it's not saying like, look how good I am, or like, look how awesome this is. It's more just like, this is something that you can go and follow and get psyched and, you know, get out the door.
Well, I mean, I've had almost every actually professional climber says something along the lines like, yeah, you know, I get paid to climb, or getting paid to climb is this. And I'm always like, you're not getting paid to climb, you're getting paid to tell us about it.
Right.
That, you know, that's what you're getting paid to do. So, yeah. But regardless, I want to ask you one last question, because we're at the end here.
Okay.
But I opened this, we were talking about being out on the trail, the things you kind of do to keep going.
Yeah.
And, you know, I mentioned this earlier off mic, that's for the folks who don't do it, even the folks who run some, you know, but don't go that far. It's really like the $1 million question. It's kind of what we want to know, because we can't imagine ourselves doing it, or maybe we maybe in the back of our head we wonder if we can. So that's the obvious question, is like being out there and how do you keep going? Just like I said, the obvious question, whether he likes it or not, to Alex Honnold is are you scared? Yeah. He hates the question. You know, I've seen him get, you know, visibly like ticked about it at times. Right. But it's the obvious question. Yeah. You know? So is there anything about what you're doing out there that you think we don't understand, or were the record's wrong, or you'd like us to know about what it is that drives you out there? Is there anything in your head you're like, God, you know, people really need to know this about what we're up to out there?
I think it's like anything that you don't know, you just naturally put barriers up against. You know, you just think that it's like this unattainable thing, right? Because if you haven't dabbled in it, and if you don't have that opportunity, you just go and be like, oh, like, this is actually not that bad, you know? Like, I think there's a lot of nearly apprehension around like starting, like that first time you put on like a pair of climbing shoes in the gym, and you're kind of like walking around and you're just like, I don't know how to tie the figure 8 or something, you know, and you get kind of stressed out about it. It's like, it's harder to go and ask and just say like, hey, how'd you do this? Like, could you know, the whole like mentorship kind of aspect of just being able to just like ask someone just like, hey, could you help me out? Like, this looks rad. Like, you know, what can I do? And I feel like sometimes in running, there's this perception of like, oh, well, it's just going to be like every time I go running, it sucks, you know? And I run like a mile and I'm freaking dying. And
I may have
like,
that perception.
Yeah, you know, you're just like, you'll go out and it's like, you know, this intimidating, like, oh, well, you run hundreds of miles. And that's like absolutely insane to me. But honestly, you know, 80 miles into a run, you're still putting one step in front of the other. It's not that complicated, right? I mean, sure, there's a lot, you know, of, you know, things that you might be going through.
All right, I'm throwing this whole podcast away then. All this stuff we've been talking about, just putting one foot in front of the other.
But ultimately, it kind of is, you know, so the barrier to entry is extremely basic. And like, you know, one of the things I say to people who like usually get into it, I was just like, the first thing you need to do is just kind of get out the door. If that means that where you are right now, it's just going to be walking, then just walk, you know? And then if you do that every day, and you do it like maybe 15 minutes a day, because that's all you got time to do, you know? Gradually, you might jog a little bit, you know? Or you might just be like, oh, I'm just going to go check out this little like like rise over there, like this little peak, or do you, so you set, I think that, the biggest mistake is to kind of put too much, like you want to do everything like well and hard immediately, and it doesn't need to be that way. Climb a ladder to start, I mean, seriously,
there's people that could benefit from that.
Yeah, I just think
they wanted to start climbing.
So I think
are out of shape or whatnot.
Yeah, I think there's just like an alienating aspect to, and maybe that's a problem with the media. Maybe it's a problem with how stories are told. Like everything is so polished and perfect, You look at images of how the sport is represented, and it's always just like, damn, dude's like, 80 miles into his run on this like crazy ridge, way the hell out there, like, and you don't see anything before or after that. All you see is this perfect photo, and sure, it's aspirational, but it feels like, I can never do that.
Right.
And so you have this disconnect with, what's going on in the image. And that's why I feel like maybe the storytelling needs to be more real, more raw, more like, I mean, man, like I'm making a film about the 14ers, I mean, half the film I'm like losing my mind and crying and just like in my head and like struggling, it's a freaking struggle. Like, I'm like nose bleeding, coughing up a lung. Like it's not pretty, And I think that for me, it's really important to show those kinds of things because that's the human experience ultimately, and it's that comes back to that stepping stone idea of like, hey, wherever you're at in life, if it's running a mile and that's going to blow your mind, then great. Like, just take that step, go and do it. And then, but don't go too hard so that the challenge is like unrealistic and you'll hate it. The first time somebody like repels you have them repel off El Cap, they'll never freaking repel ever again in their lives. You're like, that was heinous, you know what I'm saying? But if you just kind of like ease people into things, then it just becomes more like, okay, like I see this isn't as bad as I thought, right? Because I'm like no different, we're no different really, it's just like we've just chosen to apply ourselves to different activities, but we put the same kind of energy, the same kind of, intent into that. And it's all driven by intrinsic motivation. It's just like something clicked in your mind where you're like, man, I really like this, And it was the same for me. I was just like, I just really like this. And I think that I never want to impose, like, oh, you should go running, It's just like, just go out there and just like give it a try, and then maybe you'll connect with it, But also like try and stick with it for a little bit because, as you know, like one time isn't gonna, one time can be pretty demoralizing,
right.
But if you just do that little bit of consistency over like say a month or a couple months, and and if you're not jiving it with after that, maybe it's not the right thing for you, and go do something else, and it's not like I'm not trying to convince anybody, and I think that if you don't try to convince anybody, people come to it naturally, and then it doesn't seem so intimidating and it doesn't seem so crazy, and that's just how you get better. You just pour your energy into things that feel right, and yeah.
Awesome. Well, we're out of time, bud. That was awesome. I'm so glad that that you're willing to do this and we connected on it yesterday at the picnic table. Yeah, no, thanks a lot. I mean, I'm honestly really honored to be on the show, and like this is I know it's a climbing podcast, and when we talked about this a little bit at picnic table, and I was like, not sure that that this was something that people would be interested in, but so hopefully they are. Yeah, for sure. No, 100%. And yeah, so thanks so much. But yeah, it was fantastic, and just I was fascinated by it all. I still am. Cool, thanks, man. As much as you want to, let me know that I could get there someday. I still it's pretty rad what you're out there doing, even if it doesn't feel that big a deal to you. So, right. Well, thanks, man.
All right, folks, thanks for listening, and thanks to Joe for sitting down. He was slightly nervous about coming on the Enormocast, not being a hardcore climber, but I assured him that the Enormo Nation would welcome him into their loving, if slightly sinewy and veiny arms. So I hope you did. Not too long after we got this interview, Joe went on to take third place in the Hard Rock 100 that he mentions in the show as one of his favorite races, which ain't too shabby. especially when you're going up against the likes of Kilian Jornet, who won the race. So, well done, sir. Well done. Also, Joe has told me that his 14er film that he briefly mentions in the interview is getting close to being completed, so stay tuned for that in the next coming months. And, of course, I'll post it on the Facebook page if you follow over there once it comes out. All right, folks, recent events have gotten me thinking about this project called the Enormocast, what it means to people out there, and, you know, there's been 139 episodes now. Some of them have reached you guys in a pretty emotional way, and I'm pretty proud of that. And like I said, recent events have made that even more clear. So thanks again for tuning in. Thanks so much for making this thing what it is, what it has become, hopefully what it will be as we continue down the line here. Okay, I guess the best way to honor those we've lost is to stay alive. So please, 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 when you're out there skiing, when you're out there climbing, when you're on some vision quest run out in the desert or up some mountain, or doing whatever it is you do where there's very little wiggle room for error, please be safe out there. Please take care of each other. And of course, check your knot.
Come far, pilgrim.
Feels like far.
Were it worth the trouble?
What trouble?